Elena Valdez lay dying in the Arizona desert, her lips sewn shut by a town that condemned her without trial, until a bullet-wounded stranger cut her free with trembling hands. But when her tormentors returned to ensure their twisted justice was complete, would her newfound voice be enough to save them both? The scorching sun beat down on Elena's face like a hammer on hot metal. She couldn't move her lips. Black thread held them together like a twisted smile drawn by someone who hated the world. The Arizona territory stretched out forever in 1,867, nothing but red dirt and rocks that looked like broken teeth. 3 days ago, the people of Copper Falls had dragged her here. They said she killed Mrs. Henderson with poison. They said a lot of things. But Elena couldn't say anything back, because they had sewn her mouth shut with thick black thread before throwing her away like trash. Her tongue felt like sandpaper against her teeth. Water. She needed water more than anything in the world, but the closest water was back in town, where people wanted her dead. The irony tasted bitter in her dry mouth. Elena had been the school teacher. She taught children how to read big words and ask smart questions. Maybe that was her real crime. Maybe teaching kids to think for themselves scared the grown-ups more than any poison ever could. The desert was trying to kill her slowly. First came the terrible thirst that made her tongue stick to the roof of her mouth, then the heat that cooked her skin like meat over a fire. At night, the cold tried to freeze her bones. During the day, the sun tried to burn her alive. Buzzards circled overhead like black dots against the blue sky. They knew what was coming. They were patient. Death always won in the end, especially out here where nobody could hear you scream. Even if Elena could scream. She remembered the trial that wasn't really a trial. Sheriff Coleman had already decided she was guilty before anyone said a word. Mrs. Henderson had died after drinking tea at the school social. Elena had made that tea. That was enough evidence for Coleman and his friends. Guilty, they said. Witch, they whispered. Murderer, they shouted. But Elena knew the truth. Mrs. Henderson had been sick for months. Her heart was weak. Dr. Murphy had said so many times. But Dr. Murphy wasn't in town when Mrs. Henderson died. He was visiting family in Phoenix. So the people needed someone to blame. And Elena was different enough to be the perfect target. She was Mexican, in a town full of white faces. She was smart in a place where smart women made men nervous. She was unmarried at 25, which made the married women whisper about her behind their hands. She was everything they feared and didn't understand. The worst part wasn't the pain of the stitches. It wasn't even the thirst or the heat. The worst part was the silence. Elena had always used her voice to teach, to help, to make the world a little bit better. Now that voice was trapped inside her like a bird in a cage. She tried to remember her mother's face. Mama had died when Elena was 12, but she had taught Elena to be strong. Mija, she used to say, your voice is your power. Never let anyone take it away. But someone had taken it away, hadn't they? The desert played tricks on your mind. Sometimes Elena thought she saw water where there was only more sand. Sometimes she heard voices calling her name. Sometimes she saw her students running toward her across the empty land, their faces bright with the joy of learning something new. But it was all just the desert lying to her dying brain. A lizard ran across a nearby rock, its tiny feet making scratching sounds. Elena envied that lizard. It belonged here. It knew how to survive in this place that wanted everything dead. She was just a woman who had read too many books and asked too many questions. The sun was getting lower now, turning the sky orange and purple like a bruise. Soon it would be night again, and the cold would come back to try a different way of killing her. Elena had survived 3 nights already. She wondered if she would survive a 4th. Something moved on the horizon. Elena squinted through the heat waves rising from the sand. It was probably just another trick of the desert. But the shape kept getting bigger, and it looked like a person on a horse. Her heart started beating faster. Was it someone coming to save her? Or was it Sheriff Coleman coming back to make sure she was really dead? Elena couldn't tell if hope or fear was stronger in her chest. The rider was still too far away to see clearly. Elena closed her eyes and tried to save her strength. If this was rescue, she needed to be ready. If this was more trouble, she needed to be ready for that too. The desert wind picked up, blowing sand across her face. It stung her eyes and got in her nose. Everything here wanted to hurt you. But Elena was still alive, still breathing, still hoping. Maybe that counted for something. Maybe her story wasn't over yet. The horse stumbled, and its rider nearly fell from the saddle. Elena's eyes snapped open as she watched the man struggle to stay upright. This wasn't Sheriff Coleman coming to finish his dirty work. This was someone in trouble, maybe even worse trouble than hers. The stranger's horse was breathing hard, its sides covered in white foam. They had been riding fast and far. The man slumped forward like a bag of grain about to slide off a wagon. Dark stains covered his shirt, and Elena realized with a shock that it was blood. As he got closer, Elena could see his face. He was young, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair and skin that had seen too much sun. His eyes were the color of deep water, but they were clouded with pain. This was a man who was dying, just like she was. His horse stopped a few feet away from Elena's rock. The animal's head hung low, exhausted from whatever journey had brought them here. The man looked at Elena, and his eyes went wide with horror and anger. "What in God's name?" he whispered, his voice rough as sandpaper. Elena tried to make sounds through her sewn lips, but only tiny whimpers came out. The man slid off his horse, moving like every step hurt him. He walked slowly toward her, and Elena could see the blood seeping through his shirt near his chest. "Easy now," he said, like he was talking to a scared animal. "I'm not going to hurt you. Someone already did that job pretty well." He knelt down beside Elena, and she could smell sweat and blood and leather. His hands were shaking, but they looked gentle. These weren't the hands of someone who hurt people for fun. "My name is Marcus Rivera," he said. "I'm going to help you, but first I need to see what they did to your mouth." Elena nodded as much as she could. Marcus leaned closer, studying the black stitches with the careful attention of someone who had seen wounds before. His face got angrier with each stitch he counted. "Animals," he muttered. "What kind of animals do this to another human being?" He reached into his boot and pulled out a small knife. The blade was sharp and clean, which meant Marcus took care of his tools. Elena felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe this man knew what he was doing. "This is going to hurt," Marcus said, meeting her eyes. "But I'll be as careful as I can. You've been hurt enough already." Elena nodded again. Pain was nothing new to her now. She had been living with pain for 3 days. A little more wouldn't kill her, especially if it meant getting her voice back. Marcus started with the corner stitches, the ones that pulled the hardest at her skin. Each cut made Elena want to scream, but she bit down on her tongue and stayed still. The man was trying to help her. The least she could do was make his job easier. "There," Marcus said after cutting the first stitch. "One down." He worked slowly and carefully, cutting each black thread like he was defusing a bomb. Elena felt her lips start to separate, and for the first time in 3 days, she could almost taste freedom. "Who did this to you?" Marcus asked as he worked. "And why?" Elena made small sounds, trying to tell him to wait until he finished cutting. Marcus understood without words, which told Elena that this was a smart man, not just a kind one. The last stitch came free with a small pop. Elena worked her jaw carefully, feeling the dried blood crack around her lips. Everything hurt, but it was the good kind of hurt that came with healing instead of dying. "Water," Elena whispered. Her voice sounded like wind through dead leaves, but it was her voice. Marcus reached for his canteen without hesitation. He helped Elena drink slowly, letting the water wash away 3 days of desert dust and despair. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice getting stronger with each word. "I thought I was going to die without ever speaking again." "You're not dead yet," Marcus said with a weak smile. "Neither am I, though it's been close." Elena looked at the blood on his shirt. "You're hurt bad." "Bullet in the lung," Marcus said like he was talking about the weather. "Got it in a gunfight 2 days ago. Been riding toward nowhere ever since." "Why did you stop to help me?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out at the desert. Because everybody deserves the right to speak their truth, even if nobody wants to listen. Elena felt something warm spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the water. This stranger had saved her not because he knew her, but because it was the right thing to do. How long had it been since someone had shown her simple human kindness? "What's your name?" Marcus asked. "Elena Valdez. I was the school teacher in Copper Falls, until they decided I was a murderer." "Did you do it?" "No." The word came out strong and clear. But they didn't care about truth. They just needed someone to blame. Marcus nodded like he understood. Truth's a rare thing out here. Most folks prefer their stories simple, even if they're wrong. Elena studied Marcus's face. He was getting paler by the minute, and his breathing was getting shallow. This man had used his last strength to save her, and now he was paying the price. "How long do you have?" she asked. "Not long," Marcus admitted. "Maybe a few hours. Maybe less." Elena felt a strange mix of gratitude and sadness. She had been saved by a dying man who expected nothing in return, except the chance to do one good thing before the end. It seemed unfair that the world was losing someone like Marcus while keeping people like Sheriff Coleman alive. But maybe that's how it always worked. The good ones burned bright and fast, while the cruel ones lasted forever like desert rocks. "Well then," Elena said, "we'd better make those hours count." Marcus collapsed against the boulder like a puppet with cut strings. The effort of freeing Elena had drained what little strength he had left, and now his face was white as desert bones. Elena caught him before he could fall completely, feeling how heavy his body had become. "Stay with me," Elena said, her newly freed voice carrying across the empty desert. "You didn't save me just so I could watch you die." But Marcus was fading fast. His eyes kept closing, and his breathing sounded wet and wrong. Elena had seen enough sick animals on her family's ranch to know what internal bleeding looked like. The bullet had done more damage than Marcus wanted to admit. Elena looked around desperately. They needed shelter from the sun, and they needed it now. About 50 yards away, she spotted a cluster of rocks that might provide some shade. It wasn't much, but it was better than staying in the open where the heat could finish what the bullet had started. "Marcus, can you walk?" Elena asked. "Maybe," he whispered. But when he tried to stand, his legs buckled immediately. Elena made a decision that surprised her. 3 days ago, she had been a proper school teacher who fainted at the sight of blood. Now she was planning to drag a wounded man across the desert. Funny how quickly desperate situations could change a person. She got Marcus's arm around her shoulder and started walking. Each step was agony for both of them. Marcus was heavy, and Elena was weak from 3 days without food. But she kept going because the alternative was watching the man who had saved her life die in the blazing sun. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked as they stumbled forward. "Because you're wrong about one thing," Elena replied, breathing hard. "Truth isn't rare out here. Kindness is rare, and I'm not letting kindness die on my watch." They reached the rocks just as Elena's strength gave out. Both of them collapsed in the blessed shade, gasping like fish pulled from water. Elena's dress was soaked with sweat, and Marcus looked worse than ever. But they were out of the direct sun, and that was something. Elena used the last of Marcus's water to clean his wound. The bullet hole was small and neat, but she could see why he was dying. The bullet had gone in near his lung, and every breath brought up tiny specks of blood. "Tell me about the gunfight," Elena said, trying to keep Marcus awake and talking. Marcus smiled weakly. "Not much to tell. 3 men tried to rob a family outside Tucson. I tried to stop them. They shot me, I shot them. The family got away, but I didn't get away clean." "So you're a hero," Elena said. "Nah," Marcus replied. "Just someone who couldn't mind his own business." Elena studied his face. Even dying, Marcus seemed at peace with his choices. How many people could say that? How many people lived their whole lives without ever doing something truly brave? "I was supposed to get married," Elena said suddenly, surprising herself. "Before all this happened. To the banker's son." "What changed your mind?" "He did." Elena's voice got harder. "Robert Henderson was his name. Mrs. Henderson's boy. He wanted a wife who would smile pretty and keep quiet. When I started teaching the children about science and asking them to question things, he didn't like it." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "So he had you framed for murder?" "I can't prove it, but—" Elena paused, thinking, "Mrs. Henderson never liked me. She thought I was too Mexican, too smart, too independent. And Robert knew I was going to break our engagement. Maybe they decided to solve two problems at once. Poison would be a woman's weapon, Marcus said thoughtfully. And if Mrs. Henderson was already sick, she could have taken something herself, Elena finished. Made it look like I did it. All she had to do was drink tea at the school social and then take whatever poison she had hidden at home. The idea was horrible, but it made sense. A sick woman who hated her future daughter-in-law might sacrifice her own life to destroy Elena's. And Robert would inherit everything while getting rid of an unwanted bride. Evil like that takes planning, Marcus said. That means there might be evidence. Elena felt a spark of hope. If Mrs. Henderson had planned this, she might have left clues behind. A hidden bottle of poison, maybe, or a letter explaining her plan. But Elena would have to be alive to find such evidence, and right now that seemed unlikely. The sun was starting to move lower in the sky, but the heat was still terrible. Elena could feel it radiating off the rocks around them, turning their shelter into an oven. They needed water soon, or the desert would claim them both. Your horse, Elena said suddenly. Where did it go? Marcus pointed weakly toward a clump of desert plants about 100 yards away. His horse was there, cropping at the sparse grass, with the patience of an animal used to hard times. The horse meant transportation, but more importantly, it meant saddlebags that might contain supplies. I'll get him, Elena said. Too dangerous, Marcus protested. What if he runs? Then we die of thirst instead of dying of heat, Elena replied. At least this way we have a chance. Elena stood up on shaky legs. The short rest had helped a little, but she was still weak from her ordeal. Walking to the horse would take everything she had left. But Marcus was right about one thing. They couldn't survive much longer without water. She started walking across the open ground, moving slowly to avoid spooking the animal. The horse looked up as she approached but didn't run. Maybe it was too tired to care. Or maybe it sensed that Elena meant no harm. Easy, boy, Elena whispered, reaching for the reins. Your master is hurt, and we need your help. The horse let her take the reins, and Elena nearly cried with relief. In the saddlebags, she found a second canteen, some dried meat, and a small bag of oats for the horse. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to keep them alive for another day. As Elena led the horse back toward Marcus, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Dust on the horizon, moving fast toward their position. 3 riders, coming from the direction of Copper Falls. Elena's heart started racing. She recognized the way the lead rider sat his horse. Sheriff Coleman and his men were coming to make sure their justice was complete. They wanted to verify that Elena was dead, and they probably wouldn't be happy to find her very much alive. Marcus, Elena called out as she hurried back to the rocks. We have company coming, and they're not the friendly kind. Marcus struggled to sit up, his hand moving automatically toward his gun. How many? 3. And one of them is the sheriff who had my mouth sewn shut. Marcus checked his pistol with practice movements. I've got 4 bullets left, he said. Maybe 5 if I'm lucky. Elena looked at the approaching riders, then at Marcus, then at the vast desert around them. They were trapped between the heat, the lack of water, and 3 men who wanted Elena dead. The odds were not good. But Elena had learned something important in the past few days. Sometimes the only way to survive was to stop running and start fighting. She had her voice back, and she intended to use it. Then we better make every shot count, Elena said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. The riders were getting closer, and Elena could see the sunlight glinting off their weapons. In a few minutes, this quiet desert would become a battlefield. Elena just hoped she would live long enough to tell the world what had really happened to Mrs. Henderson. Get down behind the rocks, Marcus whispered urgently as the riders drew closer. His gun was in his hand now, but Elena could see how much the simple act of drawing it had cost him. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the shade, and his breathing was getting worse. Elena crouched low, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Through gaps in the rocks, she watched Sheriff Coleman and his 2 deputies spread out as they approached. They moved like hunters who had found fresh tracks, confident and deadly. I can smell the fear from here, called out Deputy Miller, a thin man with cruel eyes and tobacco-stained teeth. "Come out, Elena, and we'll make it quick." Elena's hands clenched into fists. 3 days ago, she would have been terrified into silence. But something had changed during her time in the desert. The woman who had been dragged here to die was not the same woman crouching behind these rocks. "She's probably dead already," said the other deputy, a young man named Walsh who had once been her student. Elena remembered teaching him to read, helping him with his letters when he struggled. Now he was here to kill her. "Maybe," Sheriff Coleman replied, dismounting from his horse, "but I didn't get where I am by leaving things to chance. We check the body and make sure." Marcus caught Elena's eye and made a hand signal. He would take Coleman. She would need to handle the other two somehow. It seemed impossible, but Elena had learned that impossible things happened more often than people thought. "Besides," Coleman continued, walking closer to their hiding spot, "I want to see what 3 days in the desert did to our little school teacher. Might be a good lesson for other folks who think they're too smart for their own good." Elena felt rage burn through her like wildfire. This man had ordered her mouth sewn shut and left her to die, and he was talking about it like it was justice. Like she was an animal that needed to be put down for the good of decent people. "I see tracks here," Miller called out, pointing at the ground near their rock shelter. "Fresh ones. Someone's been moving around." Elena looked at Marcus. His face was gray now, and she could see him fighting to stay conscious. He had maybe one good shot left in him, and after that, Elena would be on her own against 3 armed men. "Elena Valdez," Coleman shouted, "I know you're alive. Come out now and I'll make it clean. 1 bullet to the head, nice and quick. Keep hiding and I'll make sure you hurt before you die." Elena made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of staying hidden, she stood up and stepped into view. All 3 men turned toward her, their guns rising instinctively. "Hello, Sheriff," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "You look disappointed to see me breathing." Coleman's face went through several expressions at once: surprise, anger, and something that might have been fear. "You should be dead," he said. "Yes, I should be," Elena agreed. "But here I am, alive and talking. Amazing what happens when someone cuts the stitches you had sewn in my mouth." "Someone helped you?" Coleman's eyes scanned the rocks behind Elena. "Who?" Elena smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Someone who believes in justice. Real justice, not the twisted version you practice." "Doesn't matter," Coleman said, raising his gun. "You're still going to die out here, just taking a little longer than planned." "Before you kill me," Elena said quickly, "don't you want to know the truth about Mrs. Henderson's death?" Coleman hesitated. "You poisoned her. End of story." "Did I?" Elena asked. "Or did someone else have a reason to want her dead? Someone who knew she was already sick? Someone who could make it look like murder when it was really suicide?" Behind the rocks, Marcus was positioning himself for a shot. Elena needed to keep talking, keep the men focused on her instead of searching for her protector. "You're talking nonsense," Walsh said, but Elena could hear uncertainty in his voice. "Am I?" Elena asked. "Tell me, Sheriff, who benefits from Mrs. Henderson's death? Who inherits her money? Who gets to play the grieving son while getting rid of an unwanted bride at the same time?" Coleman's gun wavered slightly. "Robert Henderson is a respected member of this community." "Robert Henderson is a murderer," Elena said flatly. "His mother killed herself to frame me, and he let her do it. Check her room when you get back to town. I'll bet you find an empty poison bottle hidden somewhere." "Even if that's true," Miller said, "you're still going to die out here. Dead women can't testify." Elena felt a cold calm settle over her. These men were going to kill her regardless of what she said. The truth didn't matter to them. Justice didn't matter to them. Nothing mattered except maintaining their version of order. "You're right," Elena said. "Dead women can't testify, but dying men can." That was Marcus's cue. His shot rang out across the desert, and Deputy Miller fell backward with a cry of surprise and pain. The bullet had taken him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. Coleman and Walsh spun toward the sound, and Elena dove behind the rocks as their return shots chipped stone and sent fragments flying. She could hear Marcus breathing hard, and she knew that shot had taken almost everything he had left. "Two of you against a dying man and a woman," Elena called out. "Those are pretty good odds for big, tough lawmen." "Shut up!" Coleman shouted back. "Walsh, circle around behind them. I'll keep them pinned down." Elena heard Walsh moving, his boots crunching on the desert floor as he tried to get a better angle on their position. They needed to do something fast, or they would be trapped between two guns with nowhere to run. "Marcus," Elena whispered, "how many bullets left?" "Two," he replied, his voice barely audible. "Maybe three, if there was one in the chamber." Elena looked around desperately. The rocks provided good cover from the front, but Walsh would soon be in position to shoot them from the side. They needed a miracle, or they needed to create their own. That's when Elena noticed Marcus's horse, still standing patiently nearby, with the reins dragging on the ground. The animal was trained for gunfights, she realized. It hadn't run when the shooting started, which meant it was used to violence. "Can you whistle?" Elena asked Marcus. "What? Can you whistle for your horse?" Marcus gave her a confused look but put his fingers to his lips and made a sharp, piercing sound. The horse's head came up immediately, and it started walking toward them. Elena grabbed a handful of small rocks and waited. When the horse was close enough, she threw the rocks at its hindquarters and shouted, "Go!" The horse bolted directly toward Walsh, who was creeping around the side of their shelter. The deputy had to dive out of the way to avoid being trampled, and in that moment of confusion, Marcus took his shot. Walsh went down hard, his gun spinning away across the sand. That left only Sheriff Coleman, but Elena could hear him cursing and moving closer. Soon he would be close enough for a clean shot, and there would be nowhere left to hide. Elena looked at Marcus, who was barely conscious now. His last shot had been perfect, but it had also been his last shot. The gun fell from his fingers as he slumped against the rocks. Sheriff Coleman stepped into view, his gun pointed directly at Elena's head. "End of the line, school teacher," he said with a cruel smile. Elena looked up at him without fear. "You're right," she said. "It is the end of the line, but not for me." That's when Marcus's horse, still spooked from Elena's rock throwing, decided to bolt again. This time it ran straight into Sheriff Coleman, knocking him sideways and sending his gun flying. Elena didn't hesitate. She lunged for the fallen weapon, her fingers closing around the grip just as Coleman scrambled to his feet. They faced each other across 10 feet of desert sand, both breathing hard, both knowing that only one of them would walk away from this moment. "You don't have the courage to pull that trigger," Coleman said. Elena thought about 3 days with her mouth sewn shut. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's real killer walking free. She thought about Marcus dying to save a stranger, simply because it was right. "You're wrong about a lot of things, Sheriff," Elena said, "but you're especially wrong about my courage." The gun felt heavy in her hands, but her grip was steady. For the first time since this nightmare began, Elena held all the power. And she intended to use it wisely. Elena's finger trembled on the trigger as Sheriff Coleman raised his hands slowly, his eyes never leaving the gun pointed at his chest. The desert wind picked up, blowing sand between them like tiny witnesses to this moment of reckoning. "You won't shoot me," Coleman said, his voice steady despite the sweat running down his face. "You're a school teacher, not a killer. There's a difference between us, Elena, and we both know it." Elena felt the weight of the gun in her hands, heavier than any book she had ever carried. Behind her, Marcus was barely breathing, his life ebbing away with each passing second. Around them, the desert stretched endlessly, indifferent to human struggles and moral choices. "You're right," Elena said quietly. "There is a difference between us. You kill innocent people and call it justice. I teach children to think for themselves and get called a murderer." Coleman took a small step forward. "Put the gun down, and I'll make it quick. You have my word." Elena almost laughed. "Your word? The same word you gave when you promised me a fair trial? The same word you used when you told the town I was guilty?" "That was different," Coleman replied. "You were guilty. Maybe not of murder, but guilty of something women like you always are." The casual cruelty in his voice made Elena's anger flare white-hot. This man truly believed that being different, being smart, being independent, made her deserve punishment. In his world, there was no room for women who questioned authority or challenged the established order. "What am I guilty of, Sheriff?" Elena asked, her voice growing stronger. "Teaching children to read, asking them to think, refusing to marry a man who wanted to own me like property? You're guilty of forgetting your place," Coleman said, taking another step closer. "A woman's place is to be quiet, to obey, to make life easier for the men who protect her. You forgot that, and people died because of it." Elena saw movement in her peripheral vision. Deputy Miller, the one Marcus had shot in the shoulder, was crawling toward his fallen gun. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes burned with determination. Elena realized she was about to be caught between two enemies. "Behind you," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible but urgent. Elena spun around just as Miller's fingers closed around his pistol. Without thinking, she pulled the trigger. The gun kicked in her hands like a living thing, and Miller fell backward with a cry of pain and surprise. Elena had shot him in the leg, stopping his attack but not killing him. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the desert like thunder. Elena's ears rang, and the smell of gunpowder filled her nose. She had never shot anyone before, never even fired a gun. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow. Coleman used her moment of shock to lunge forward. His hands closed around the gun barrel, and suddenly they were wrestling for control of the weapon. Elena held on desperately, knowing that if she lost the gun, she was dead. Coleman was bigger and stronger, but Elena was fighting for her life. She used every dirty trick she could think of, kicking at his shins and trying to bite his hands. They rolled in the sand, grunting and struggling, the gun between them like a deadly prize. "Should have stayed quiet," Coleman gasped as they fought. "Should have accepted your fate like a good woman." Elena managed to knee him in the stomach, making him double over in pain. She scrambled backward, still holding the gun, her dress torn and her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "My fate?" Elena panted. "My fate is to survive this and tell the world what kind of man you really are." Coleman straightened up slowly, his hand moving toward a knife on his belt. Elena saw the blade flash in the sunlight and realized their fight was far from over. This man would never stop hunting her, never stop trying to silence her voice. That's when she heard something that changed everything. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, approaching fast from the direction of town. Elena's heart sank, thinking more deputies were coming to help Coleman finish his work. But Coleman's face went white as paper. "No," he whispered. "They weren't supposed to come yet." Through the heat shimmer, Elena could see 4 riders approaching. As they got closer, she realized these weren't deputies. One of them was wearing a suit that looked expensive even from a distance. Another had the bearing of a military man. The third looked like a doctor, with a black bag tied to his saddle. The 4th rider made Elena's breath catch in her throat. It was Dr. Murphy, the physician who had been treating Mrs. Henderson before her death. He was supposed to be in Phoenix, visiting family. What was he doing here? "Sheriff Coleman," called the man in the suit, as the riders came within shouting distance. "We need to talk." Coleman's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, and finally, resignation. "Judge Harrison," he called back. "You're early." Elena felt confused. Why was a judge here? And why did Coleman look like he had seen a ghost? Dr. Murphy dismounted first, his eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. He saw Marcus bleeding against the rocks, Elena holding the gun, and the 2 wounded deputies scattered across the sand. "Dear God," Dr. Murphy said. "What happened here?" "Justice," Elena said simply. "Or maybe just survival. I'm not sure there's a difference anymore." Judge Harrison climbed down from his horse with the careful movements of an older man. Elena had heard of him but never seen him before. He was supposed to be honest, one of the few territorial judges who couldn't be bought or intimidated. "Sheriff Coleman," Judge Harrison said formally, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and abuse of office." Elena's world tilted sideways. "What?" Dr. Murphy was already moving toward Marcus, his medical bag in hand. "This man needs immediate attention," he said. "He's lost a lot of blood." The military man, who Elena now recognized as Colonel Hayes from the territorial government, was surveying the scene with sharp eyes. "Miss Valdez?" I presume? We've been looking for you. Looking for me? Elena still felt like she was dreaming. Why? Because, Judge Harrison said, we received some very interesting information about Mrs. Henderson's death. Information that proves you were innocent all along. Coleman was backing away slowly, his hand still on his knife. You can't prove anything, he said. A woman is dead, and someone has to pay for it. You're right, Dr. Murphy said, looking up from treating Marcus. Someone does have to pay, but it's not Elena. Elena lowered the gun slightly. I don't understand. How did you know to come here? Robert Henderson, Judge Harrison explained. Guilt is a powerful thing, Miss Valdez. Yesterday morning, he walked into my office and confessed everything. Elena felt the desert spin around her. Robert confessed? His mother convinced him to frame you. Colonel Hayes continued. She was dying anyway, from a weak heart. But she hated the idea of you marrying her son, hated everything you represented, so she made a plan. Dr. Murphy's voice was quiet but clear. She poisoned herself with digitalis from her own heart medicine. Too much of it will stop the heart, but it looks like natural causes unless you know what to look for. Robert was supposed to inherit everything and live happily without an unwanted bride, Judge Harrison added. But he couldn't live with watching an innocent woman die for his mother's hatred. Elena sank to her knees in the sand, the gun falling from her numb fingers. 3 days of hell, 3 days of believing she would die alone and silenced, and it had all been for nothing. The truth had come out anyway. Coleman was edging toward his horse now, clearly planning to run, but Colonel Hayes was faster, drawing his own weapon and pointing it at the sheriff's back. I wouldn't, the colonel said calmly. You're already in enough trouble. Elena looked at Marcus, who was conscious again thanks to Dr. Murphy's ministrations. His eyes met hers across the sand, and she saw something there that made her heart skip. Respect, admiration. Maybe even something deeper. You did it, Marcus whispered. You survived. Elena smiled through her tears. We both did. But even as relief flooded through her, Elena knew this wasn't really over. Coleman was under arrest, but there were still people in Copper Falls who had supported what he did. There were still those who would see her as a troublemaker, a woman who didn't know her place. The question was, what would she do with her newfound freedom? Dr. Murphy worked over Marcus with the focused intensity of a man who had seen too many battlefield wounds. His hands moved quickly and surely, cleaning the bullet wound and applying fresh bandages, while Marcus gritted his teeth against the pain. You're lucky, Dr. Murphy said. The bullet missed your lung by about an inch. You'll live, but you need proper rest and medicine. Elena watched from nearby, still trying to process everything that had happened. Judge Harrison was questioning the wounded deputies, while Colonel Hayes kept his gun trained on Sheriff Coleman. The desert, that had seemed so empty and hostile just minutes ago, now buzzed with activity. Miss Valdez, Judge Harrison called, I need to ask you some questions about what happened here. Elena walked over to the judge, her legs still shaky from shock and exhaustion. I'll tell you everything, she said. But first, I need to know something. How did Robert find the courage to confess? Judge Harrison's weathered face softened slightly. Apparently, he couldn't sleep. Every night, he saw your face when they sewed your mouth shut. His mother had told him it would be quick, that you would die in the desert and it would all be over. But knowing you were out here suffering ate away at him. Good, Elena said, surprised by the hardness in her own voice. He should suffer. What he did was unforgivable. Perhaps, the judge replied, but his confession saved your life. If he hadn't come forward, we never would have known where to look for you. Elena glanced at Marcus, who was now sitting up against the rocks with proper bandages around his chest. Marcus saved my life, she said. Robert just cleaned up his own mess. Colonel Hayes approached with Sheriff Coleman's hands tied behind his back. The sheriff looked older somehow, defeated in a way that went beyond simple arrest. His whole world of corrupt power and casual cruelty was crumbling around him. What will happen to him? Elena asked. Trial, Judge Harrison said simply. A real trial this time, with evidence and witnesses and proper procedures. He'll probably hang. Elena felt she should be happy about that, But mostly she just felt tired. Too much violence, too much hatred, too much pain. She wanted it all to be over. And what about the people in town who supported him? Elena asked. The ones who cheered when they sewed my mouth shut? Colonel Hayes shifted uncomfortably. That's more complicated. Mob justice is ugly, but it's not always illegal. We can't arrest a whole town for being afraid and stupid. Elena nodded, understanding but not liking it. Fear and stupidity had nearly killed her, and most of the people responsible would face no consequences. They would go back to their lives, maybe feeling a little ashamed, but fundamentally unchanged. There's something else, Judge Harrison said carefully. Robert Henderson has asked to see you. He wants to apologize in person. Elena's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want to see the man whose cowardice had put her through hell, but then she thought about it more deeply. Maybe facing Robert would help her understand how ordinary people could do such extraordinary evil. Where is he now? Elena asked. In Copper Falls, under guard, Colonel Hayes replied. We can arrange a meeting if you want one. Elena looked out at the desert that had nearly been her grave. The sun was getting lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Soon it would be night, and the stars would come out to bear witness to this strange day of justice and redemption. I'll see him, Elena decided, but not in town. I never want to set foot in Copper Falls again. Dr. Murphy looked up from checking Marcus's pulse. This man needs to get to a real hospital soon. The nearest one is in Phoenix, about 2 days' ride if we take it easy. Phoenix sounds good, Elena said. I could use a change of scenery. Marcus caught her eye. What will you do after that? Go back to teaching? Elena considered the question. 3 days ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. Teaching was her calling, her passion, her identity. But the woman who had fought for her life in the desert was not the same woman who had stood in front of a classroom explaining grammar and arithmetic. I don't know, Elena admitted. Maybe I'll teach. Maybe I'll do something else. Maybe I'll write about what happened here. Make sure people know the truth. The territory needs good teachers, Colonel Hayes said. Educated women who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right. The territory also needs good lawyers. Judge Harrison added with a slight smile. I've been watching you handle yourself today, Miss Valdez. You have a sharp mind and a strong sense of justice. Ever think about studying law? Elena blinked in surprise. Women can't be lawyers. Women can't do a lot of things, the judge replied. Until they do them anyway. The world is changing, Miss Valdez. Maybe it's time to help it change a little faster. Elena felt something spark inside her chest. A new possibility. A different kind of future than she had ever imagined. She had always believed in justice, but she had never thought about fighting for it professionally. I'll think about it, she said. Dr. Murphy finished packing his medical supplies. We should start moving soon. Marcus is stable, but I want to get him to proper facilities before infection sets in. As the group prepared to leave, Elena took one last look at the place where she had nearly died. The rocks that had sheltered her and Marcus were already disappearing into the landscape, becoming just another part of the endless desert. In a few months, wind and sand would erase all traces of their struggle. But Elena would remember. She would remember the taste of freedom when Marcus cut her stitches. She would remember the weight of the gun in her hands and the choice to use it wisely. She would remember that ordinary people were capable of both terrible cruelty and unexpected heroism. Most importantly, she would remember that her worth had never been determined by what other people thought of her. It came from her own choices, her own courage, her own refusal to be silenced. Ready? Marcus asked, accepting help to mount his horse. Elena took the reins of Deputy Miller's horse, which Colonel Hayes had given her to ride. Ready, she said. As they rode away from the desert battlefield, Elena felt the wind on her face and tasted the dust of new possibilities. Behind them, the sun was setting on one chapter of her life. Ahead, the stars were beginning to appear in a sky full of infinite potential. Elena Valdez had found her voice in the desert. Now she was going to use it to change the world. The group rode toward Phoenix in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. But Elena wasn't thinking about the past anymore. She was thinking about the future, and for the first time in days, that future looked bright with promise. Justice had many forms, Elena realized. Sometimes it was a bullet stopping a cruel man. Sometimes it was a guilty conscience forcing a confession. Sometimes it was simply the courage to keep speaking truth when the whole world wanted you to be quiet. All of them mattered. All of them had brought her to this moment, riding free under an Arizona sky with her voice intact and her spirit unbroken. Elena smiled and urged her horse forward, eager to see what tomorrow would bring. The Adobe Inn in Tucson appeared like a mirage after 2 days of hard riding across the Arizona territory. Elena dismounted carefully, her body aching from hours in the saddle and the lingering effects of her desert ordeal. The setting sun painted the building's walls gold, and the smell of cooking food made her stomach growl with fierce hunger. Marcus needed help getting down from his horse. Despite Dr. Murphy's excellent field treatment, the bullet wound had taken a serious toll on his strength. Elena steadied him as he swayed on his feet, noting how pale he still looked despite the improvement in his breathing. "One more day to Phoenix," Dr. Murphy said, checking Marcus's pulse again. "You're doing better than expected, but don't push too hard." Inside the inn, Elena felt the weight of curious stares from other travelers. News traveled fast in the territory, and whispers followed them like shadows. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with suspicion. A woman who had survived what she had survived made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite explain. Judge Harrison had arranged for a private room where Elena could meet with Robert Henderson. The young man sat hunched in a chair by the window, looking nothing like the confident banker's son she remembered. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much of his own darkness. "Elena," Robert said when she entered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you would come." Elena took the chair across from him, studying his face carefully. "I almost didn't. What could you possibly say that would matter now?" Robert's hands shook as he reached for a glass of water on the small table between them. "I know nothing I say can undo what happened, but I need you to understand why." "Why?" Elena's voice carried a sharp edge. "Why your mother decided I deserved to die. Why you let her do it. Why you watched them sew my mouth shut and said nothing." "She was dying," Robert said desperately. "The doctor said she had maybe 2 months left. Her heart was failing, and she was in constant pain. She said if she was going to die anyway, at least she could protect me from making the biggest mistake of my life." Elena felt anger burn in her chest like acid. "Marrying me was the biggest mistake of your life." "Not marrying you," Robert clarified quickly. "Marrying anyone my mother didn't approve of. She said you would change me, make me weak, fill my head with ideas about treating women as equals instead of knowing their proper place." The honesty in his words was almost worse than lies would have been. Elena realized that Robert truly believed his mother had been trying to help him, even as she planned cold-blooded murder. "So you let her poison herself and frame me for it," Elena said flatly. Robert's face crumpled. "I didn't know that's what she was planning. She just said she had a way to solve our problem, that you would go away and I wouldn't have to worry about disappointing her anymore." Elena leaned forward in her chair. "When did you find out the truth?" "The night they took you to the desert," Robert admitted. "I found the empty medicine bottle in her room, hidden behind her jewelry box. There was a note explaining everything. She said she loved me too much to watch me throw my life away on a woman who would never know her place." Elena felt sick. Mrs. Henderson had planned her own death carefully, making sure her son would discover the truth only after it was too late to stop the plan. It was manipulation of the cruelest kind, using love as a weapon to destroy an innocent person. "Why didn't you speak up then?" Elena demanded. "You could have stopped them from leaving me in the desert." Robert's voice broke. "I was scared." Mother said in her note that if I ever told anyone the truth, people would think I helped plan it. They would hang me right next to you. Elena stared at him in disbelief. "So you let me suffer for 3 days because you were afraid of consequences for crimes you didn't even commit?" "I couldn't sleep," Robert said, tears streaming down his face. "Every night I saw your face when they sewed your mouth shut. I heard you trying to scream through the stitches. I knew you were out there dying because of my cowardice." Elena felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to hate Robert for his weakness. But another part recognized that he was as much a victim of his mother's manipulation as she was. Mrs. Henderson had poisoned more than just herself. She had poisoned her son's conscience and Elena's reputation with the same careful planning. "What made you finally confess?" Elena asked. Robert looked out the window at the darkening sky. "I realized that watching you die would make me exactly the kind of man my mother wanted me to be. Weak, selfish, willing to sacrifice others to avoid personal discomfort. I didn't want to be that person anymore." Elena sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything she had heard. Robert's confession had saved her life, but it had come 3 days too late to save her from the worst experience of her existence. The scars on her lips would fade, but the memory of being silenced and abandoned would stay with her forever. "I can't forgive you," Elena said finally. "Not yet, maybe not ever. But I understand why you did what you did." Robert nodded, seeming to accept her words without argument. "What will happen to me now?" "Judge Harrison says you'll face charges for conspiracy and accessory to attempted murder," Elena replied. "But your confession will count in your favor. You'll probably spend some time in prison, but you won't hang." "And you?" Robert asked. "What will you do now?" Elena considered the question. 3 days ago, her biggest worry had been whether to break their engagement cleanly or wait for him to call it off. Now she was contemplating a completely different life, one where she fought for justice instead of just teaching children to read. "I'm going to study law," Elena said, the words feeling strange but right in her mouth. "I'm going to make sure what happened to me never happens to another woman." Robert's eyes widened. "Women can't be lawyers." Elena smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Women can't do a lot of things, Robert, until they do them anyway." She stood up, feeling the conversation had reached its natural end. There was nothing more to say, no forgiveness to offer or receive. Robert would have to live with his choices, just as she would have to live with the consequences of his cowardice. "Goodbye, Robert," Elena said. "I hope you become a better man than your mother wanted you to be." As Elena left the room, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Facing Robert had been necessary, but it was also a closing of old chapters. The woman who had been engaged to marry him was gone, left behind in the desert along with all her old certainties about life and justice. Outside the inn, Elena found Marcus sitting on a bench, breathing carefully in the cool evening air. Dr. Murphy had said the night air would be good for his lungs, and he looked better than he had since the gunfight. "How did it go?" Marcus asked. Elena sat down beside him, grateful for his solid presence. "About as well as could be expected. He's not evil, just weak. Sometimes that's worse." Marcus nodded understanding. Weak people can do terrible things when they're scared, but at least he found the courage to do the right thing eventually. Elena looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Do you think people can really change? Or are we all just stuck being who we've always been?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering her question. "I think we're all capable of being better than we were yesterday. The question is whether we choose to do the work." Elena thought about her own transformation over the past few days. The timid schoolteacher who had accepted her fate without question was gone. In her place was someone harder, stronger, more determined to fight for what was right. "I choose to do the work," Elena said quietly. Marcus smiled, and in the lamplight from the inn's windows, Elena could see that his color was slowly returning. He would live, she realized with relief. They both would live, and that was no small miracle. Tomorrow they would reach Phoenix. Tomorrow she would begin the long journey toward becoming the woman she was meant to be. But tonight, she was content to sit beside the man who had given her back her voice and watch the stars come out over the Arizona territory. The desert had nearly killed her, but it had also taught her the most important lesson of her life, that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about refusing to let the world make you smaller than you were meant to be. Elena Valdez had found her voice in the silence of the desert. Now she was going to use it to change everything. The Phoenix courthouse buzzed with activity as Elena walked through its doors 3 months later, her arms full of law books and her mind sharp with new knowledge. She had spent every day since leaving the desert studying, reading, and preparing for the territorial bar examination that most people said she would never be allowed to take. Judge Harrison waited for her in his temporary chambers, his weathered face showing both approval and concern. "Miss Valdez, you've made remarkable progress. But I have to warn you, the Territorial Bar Association is not eager to examine a woman candidate." Elena set down her books with careful precision. Her hands, once soft from years of teaching children, now bore calluses from writing thousands of pages of legal notes. "Let them try to stop me. I've survived worse than bureaucratic prejudice." The judge smiled at her confidence, but his eyes remained serious. "There's something else. Robert Henderson's trial starts next week, and the prosecutor wants you to testify. Are you prepared for that?" Elena had been dreading this moment for weeks. Facing Robert privately had been difficult enough. Telling her story in open court, in front of strangers who would judge every word, felt like walking back into the desert all over again. "I'll testify," Elena said firmly. "The jury needs to hear what really happened." Through the courthouse windows, Elena could see the bustling streets of Phoenix. The city was growing fast, filled with people seeking new opportunities in the expanding territory. Some of those people, she knew, would be sympathetic to her story. Others would see her as a troublemaker who refused to accept her proper place in society. Marcus appeared in the doorway, moving carefully but without assistance. His recovery had been slower than Dr. Murphy had hoped, but steady. The bullet wound had healed cleanly, leaving only a small scar and occasional shortness of breath to remind him of that day in the desert. "The prosecutor is ready to see you," Marcus said. "He wants to go over your testimony one more time." Elena gathered her books and followed Marcus down the courthouse corridor. She had grown accustomed to the stares and whispers that followed her everywhere. Some people looked at her with admiration, others with suspicion or outright hostility. She had learned to ignore them all. Prosecutor Williams was a thin man with sharp eyes and a reputation for thorough preparation. He had taken Robert Henderson's case personally after learning the full details of what had happened in Copper Falls. "Miss Valdez," Williams said as she entered his office, "I want you to understand what you're walking into tomorrow. The defense attorney is going to try to make you look like a vengeful woman seeking revenge against an innocent man." Elena took a seat across from his desk. "Robert Henderson is many things, but innocent isn't one of them. He watched them sew my mouth shut and left me to die. That's not innocence. It's cowardice. The defense will argue that he was manipulated by his dying mother," Williams continued. "They'll say he was a victim too, that he shouldn't be punished for his mother's crimes." "And what do you say?" Elena asked. Williams leaned forward, his expression intense. "I say that choosing to stay silent while an innocent person suffers makes you an accessory to that suffering. Robert Henderson had multiple opportunities to speak up and save you. He chose his own comfort over your life." Elena nodded approvingly. This was exactly the argument she had hoped the prosecutor would make. Robert's eventual confession didn't erase the 3 days of hell he had allowed her to endure. "There's one more thing," Williams said carefully. "The defense is bringing character witnesses from Copper Falls. People who will testify that you were a disruptive influence in the community, that you encouraged children to question their parents' authority." Elena felt a familiar flash of anger. So teaching children to think for themselves is now evidence of criminal character. "In some people's minds, yes," Williams replied honestly. "You need to be prepared for some very hostile questioning about your teaching methods and your political beliefs." Marcus shifted in his chair. "What kind of political beliefs?" Williams consulted his notes. "They're going to ask about your views on women's suffrage, your support for Mexican land rights, and your criticism of territorial justice practices. Essentially, they want to paint you as a radical who brought her troubles on herself." Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street below. 3 months ago, she would have been terrified by the prospect of such public scrutiny. Now she felt only determination. "Let them ask their questions," Elena said. "I'll answer them honestly. Yes, I believe women should have the right to vote. Yes, I think Mexican families who've lived here for generations deserve to keep their land. And yes, I think a justice system that allows sheriffs to sew women's mouths shut needs serious reform. Williams made notes as she spoke. Good. Honesty will serve you better than trying to appear harmless. The jury needs to see you as you really are, a strong woman who refused to be silenced. Elena turned back to face the two men. What about Sheriff Coleman's trial? When will that happen? Next month, Williams replied. He's facing charges of assault, conspiracy, abuse of office, and attempted murder. If convicted on all counts, he'll hang. Elena felt no satisfaction at the prospect of Coleman's execution. She had seen enough death and violence to last a lifetime. But she also knew that some people only understood consequences when they came in the form of rope and wooden scaffolds. Will I have to testify at that trial too? Elena asked. Yes, but that one should be easier, Williams said. Coleman has fewer friends than Robert Henderson, and his crimes were more obviously brutal. Public opinion is strongly against him. Elena nodded, filing the information away for future consideration. She had learned to think like a lawyer over the past 3 months, breaking complex situations down into manageable pieces and considering all possible outcomes. Is there anything else I should know before tomorrow? Elena asked. Williams hesitated, then decided to speak plainly. The judge for Robert's trial is Judge Morrison. He's traditional in his views about women's roles in society. He may not be entirely sympathetic to your perspective. Elena almost laughed. A traditional judge in a case about a woman who was nearly murdered for refusing to be traditional. How perfectly appropriate. Judge Morrison is fair, Marcus said quietly. He may not like your politics, but he respects the law. If you stick to the facts and avoid lecturing about women's rights, you should be fine. Elena considered this advice. She had spent 3 months learning to navigate a world that didn't want her in it, discovering when to fight and when to be strategic. Tomorrow would be another test of those hard-won skills. I'll be careful, Elena promised, but I won't pretend to be someone I'm not. That's what got me into trouble in the first place. As Elena prepared to leave the prosecutor's office, Williams handed her a telegram that had arrived that morning. This came for you, he said, from a newspaper in San Francisco. Elena read the telegram quickly, her eyes widening with surprise. The San Francisco Chronicle wanted to interview her about her case and her plans to become a lawyer. They were planning a series of articles about women breaking barriers in the West. National attention, Marcus observed. Are you ready for that? Elena folded the telegram and put it in her bag. I don't know if anyone is ever ready for that kind of attention. But if my story can help other women find the courage to speak up, then it's worth the discomfort. As they left the courthouse, Elena reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning in the desert, when Marcus had cut the stitches from her lips. She had gone from being a woman who wanted only to teach children and live quietly to someone who was challenging the very foundations of territorial society. The transformation hadn't been easy. There were days when she missed the simplicity of her old life, when the weight of being a symbol for women's rights felt too heavy to bear. But there was no going back now. The woman who had accepted her fate without question was gone, replaced by someone who fought for justice with every breath. Tomorrow, she would face Robert Henderson in court and tell the world what had really happened in Copper Falls. The day after that, she would continue her legal studies. Next month, she would testify against Sheriff Coleman. And someday, if she was very lucky and very determined, she would stand before a jury as a lawyer herself, fighting for other women who had been silenced by fear and prejudice. Elena Valdez had found her voice in the desert. Now she was going to use it to change the law itself. Elena's hand trembled as she placed it on the Bible in the Phoenix courthouse, the leather binding warm from the Arizona sun streaming through tall windows. The packed courtroom fell silent as Judge Morrison's stern voice filled the air. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do, Elena said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room despite the knot of fear in her stomach. The courtroom was divided like a church congregation, with supporters on one side and skeptics on the other. Elena recognized faces from newspaper illustrations, reporters who had traveled from as far as San Francisco to cover the trial. In the front row, Marcus sat with Dr. Murphy and Judge Harrison, their presence a steady anchor in the sea of hostile stares. Robert Henderson looked smaller than she remembered, hunched between his expensive lawyers like a man trying to disappear. His eyes met hers briefly across the courtroom before he looked away, unable to hold her gaze. Prosecutor Williams approached the witness stand with measured steps. Miss Valdez, please tell the jury what happened on the morning of May 15th, 1867. Elena had practiced this moment dozens of times, but facing 12 men who would judge her every word felt different than rehearsing with Marcus in their hotel room. She took a deep breath and began her story, starting with the knock on her door that had changed everything. Sheriff Coleman and his deputies came to arrest me for Mrs. Henderson's murder, Elena said, her voice growing stronger with each word. They didn't ask questions. They didn't investigate. They had already decided I was guilty. What happened next? Williams prompted. Elena's fingers unconsciously touched the faint scars on her lips. They held a trial that wasn't really a trial. No evidence was presented except that I had made tea at the school social where Mrs. Henderson collapsed. When I tried to speak in my own defense, they told me to be quiet. The defense attorney, a well-dressed man named Stevens, objected. Your Honor, the witness is characterizing legal proceedings without proper foundation. Judge Morrison nodded curtly. Sustained. Miss Valdez, please stick to what you personally observed. Elena felt the first flash of frustration but kept her voice level. I observed Sheriff Coleman ordering his men to hold me down, while the town seamstress sewed my mouth shut with black thread. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Several jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Elena saw one man's face go pale as he imagined what she had endured. Did anyone try to stop this? Williams asked. Elena's eyes found Robert in the crowd. The defendant was present. He watched the entire procedure without saying a word. What happened after your mouth was sewn shut? They loaded me into a wagon and drove me out to the desert. Sheriff Coleman told me I had 3 days to make peace with God before the buzzards finished what justice had started. Elena continued her testimony for nearly an hour, describing the heat, the thirst, the certainty that she would die alone and voiceless. When she reached the part about Marcus finding her, several women in the gallery were wiping away tears. Stevens rose for cross-examination with the confidence of a man who had destroyed many witnesses before. Miss Valdez, you've painted yourself as an innocent victim, but let's examine your behavior leading up to these events. Isn't it true that you encouraged children to question their parents' authority? Elena had expected this attack. I encouraged them to think for themselves, yes. And you taught them about scientific theories that contradicted biblical teachings? I taught them about natural history and basic science, the same subjects taught in schools back east. Stevens smiled coldly. You also spoke publicly about women's suffrage, didn't you? Elena straightened in her chair. Yes, I believe women should have the right to vote. And you criticized the territorial government's treatment of Mexican landowners? I believe all people deserve fair treatment under the law, regardless of their ancestry. Stevens was building to something, and Elena could sense the trap closing around her. So, you admit to being a political agitator who used her position as a teacher to spread radical ideas? Williams objected, but Stevens continued. Isn't it possible, Miss Valdez, that Mrs. Henderson died of natural causes, and that your enemies in town used her death as an excuse to get rid of a troublesome woman? Elena felt the courtroom's attention shift subtly. Stevens was planting doubt about whether there had been a conspiracy at all, suggesting that she had been the victim of mob justice, rather than planned murder. Mrs. Henderson poisoned herself to frame me, Elena said firmly. Her son has confessed to knowing about the plan. Ah, yes, Mr. Henderson's confession, Stevens said with theatrical skepticism. A confession made under extreme duress, after 3 days of believing you were dead. Don't you think guilt over your supposed death might have driven him to confess to crimes he didn't commit? Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Stevens was good at his job, weaving doubt into every answer she gave. She glanced at the jury and saw uncertainty on several faces. The evidence will show, Elena began. The evidence will show that a young man was driven to false confession by grief and manipulation. Stevens interrupted. No further questions. Elena left the witness stand feeling like she had fought a battle without knowing all the rules. Williams tried to repair the damage during redirect examination, but Stevens had accomplished his goal. The jury was now wondering whether Robert Henderson was another victim rather than a conspirator. During the lunch recess, Elena walked outside the courthouse with Marcus, needing fresh air and space to think. The Phoenix streets bustled with normal life. Merchants hawking their wares, children playing in the dust, women shopping for their families. It felt strange that the world continued its daily routine while her future hung in the balance. You did well in there, Marcus said, though Elena could hear the concern in his voice. Stevens made me look like a radical troublemaker who brought her problems on herself, Elena replied. I could see some of the jury members nodding along with his questions. Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her. Elena, listen to me. You are a radical troublemaker. That's not a bad thing. This territory needs people who ask hard questions and demand better answers. Elena managed a small smile. Even if it means losing this case? Even then, Marcus said seriously, some fights are worth having regardless of whether you win. They were interrupted by a commotion near the courthouse steps. A group of women had gathered, holding signs that read, Justice for Elena, and Women Deserve to Speak. Elena recognized some faces from her teaching days, mothers whose children she had educated, women who had attended her informal discussions about literature and current events. Miss Valdez, called out Martha Williams, the prosecutor's wife. We want you to know that not everyone believes Mr. Stevens' lies about you. Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest. These women had risked social disapproval to show their support publicly. In 1,867 Arizona territory, that took real courage. Thank you, Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. Your support means more than you know. As Elena and Marcus returned to the courthouse, she felt something shift inside her. Win or lose, she was no longer fighting this battle alone. The woman who had been abandoned in the desert had found allies she never expected. But Stevens wasn't finished with his assault on her character. That afternoon, he called a series of witnesses from Copper Falls who testified about Elena's inappropriate teaching methods and unwomanly political opinions. Each witness painted her as a dangerous influence on traditional family values. The most damaging testimony came from Mrs. Sarah Foster, the banker's wife who had organized the school social, where Mrs. Henderson collapsed. Elena Valdez filled those children's heads with nonsense about equality and questioning authority. Mrs. Foster said primly, she told my daughter that women were just as smart as men and deserved the same opportunities. That's not natural or Christian. Elena watched the jury's faces as Mrs. Foster spoke. Several men nodded approvingly at her words. In their world, a woman who challenged traditional roles was inherently suspect, regardless of whether she had committed any actual crimes. By the end of the day, Elena felt exhausted and discouraged. Stevens had successfully shifted the focus from Robert Henderson's crimes to her own unconventional beliefs. Even if the jury believed she hadn't poisoned Mrs. Henderson, they might decide she had deserved punishment for her other transgressions. That evening, Elena sat in her hotel room reviewing law books by lamplight. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, and then the jury would decide Robert's fate, and by extension, hers. If they found him not guilty, it would be a public declaration that what had happened to her was acceptable justice for a woman who forgot her place. Marcus knocked on her door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a telegram. This just arrived for you, he said. Elena opened the telegram with trembling fingers. It was from a women's rights organization in California, offering to fund her legal education regardless of the trial's outcome. They had read about her case in the newspapers and wanted to support her goal of becoming a lawyer. Good news? Marcus asked. Elena folded the telegram carefully and put it in her bag with the others that had arrived over the past week. Support had poured in from unexpected places: women's groups, teachers' associations, even some territorial officials who believed in legal reform. Very good news, Elena said. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm going to keep fighting for justice, not just for myself, but for every woman who's been told to stay quiet and accept her fate. Marcus smiled and raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. To the most dangerous woman in the Arizona territory. Elena clinked her cup against his. To dangerous women everywhere. Outside her window, the lights of Phoenix twinkled like earthbound stars. Tomorrow would bring the verdict that would define not just Robert Henderson's future, but Elena's place in territorial history. Whatever the jury decided, Elena Valdez was no longer the silent schoolteacher who had been dragged into the desert to die. She was a woman who had found her voice and intended to use it, regardless of the consequences. The battle for justice was just beginning. The jury filed back into the courtroom after 3 hours of deliberation, their faces revealing nothing about the decision that would reshape Elena's understanding of justice. Judge Morrison called for order as spectators leaned forward in their seats, the tension thick as desert dust in the air. Elena sat in the front row between Marcus and Judge Harrison, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. Across the aisle, Robert Henderson stood beside his expensive lawyers, his face pale and drawn with the weight of waiting. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Morrison asked. The foreman, a weathered rancher named Thompson, stood slowly. "We have, Your Honor." Elena held her breath. Everything she had endured, the desert, the pain, the long months of legal preparation, came down to these next few words. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by a strange emptiness. She had expected to feel triumphant, but mostly she just felt tired. Robert Henderson's conviction couldn't undo the 3 days of hell he had helped inflict on her. On the charge of accessory to attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. Robert's legs buckled, and his lawyers had to catch him to keep him from falling. Elena watched his collapse with mixed emotions. He was finally facing consequences for his cowardice, but seeing his terror brought her no satisfaction. Judge Morrison called for sentencing recommendations, and Prosecutor Williams rose to address the court. "Your Honor, the defendant's crimes were heinous, but his eventual confession saved Miss Valdez's life. We recommend 5 years in territorial prison." Defense attorney Stevens argued for probation, claiming Robert had been manipulated by his dying mother and had already suffered enough guilt for his actions. Elena watched the legal theater with the detached interest of someone who had learned to see justice as a complex equation rather than simple revenge. Judge Morrison announced he would render his sentence the following morning, then dismissed the court. As people filed out of the courtroom, Elena found herself surrounded by reporters shouting questions about her plans and her reaction to the verdict. "Miss Valdez, will you continue pursuing a legal career? How do you feel about Mr. Henderson's conviction? What message does this case send to other women?" Elena raised her hand for quiet, and the crowd gradually settled. She had learned to handle media attention over the past months, discovering that reporters responded well to direct, honest answers. "Justice isn't about revenge," Elena said clearly. "It's about ensuring that what happened to me never happens to another woman. Mr. Henderson's conviction is a step in that direction, but it's only the beginning." "What about Sheriff Coleman's trial next month?" called out a reporter from the Tucson Daily Star. "I'll testify truthfully about his crimes, just as I did today," Elena replied. "But the real change won't come from individual trials. It will come from reforming laws that allow such injustices to happen in the first place." As the reporters dispersed, Elena noticed a well-dressed woman approaching her with purpose. She was perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Miss Valdez? I'm Catherine Morrison, Judge Morrison's daughter. I wonder if we might speak privately." Elena felt surprise and curiosity in equal measure. Judge Morrison had been correct but cold throughout the trial, showing no particular sympathy for her situation. What could his daughter want? They found a quiet corner of the courthouse lobby, away from the lingering crowd. Catherine Morrison spoke in low, urgent tones. "Miss Valdez, my father asked me to speak with you. He couldn't say this officially, but he was impressed by your testimony and your composure under hostile questioning." Elena raised an eyebrow. "I got the impression your father disapproved of my politics." Catherine smiled slightly. My father disapproves of many things, but he respects courage and intelligence. He wanted you to know that the territorial bar examination will be administered next month, and qualified candidates will be considered regardless of gender. Elena's heart started beating faster. Are you saying? I'm saying that if you pass the examination, my father will personally recommend your admission to the territorial bar. Catherine continued. The territory needs good lawyers, Ms. Valdez. It needs lawyers who understand that justice isn't just for wealthy white men. Elena felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. The path to becoming a lawyer would still be difficult, filled with prejudice and professional obstacles. But at least the door was opening, even if only a crack. Tell your father I accept his challenge, Elena said. I'll take the examination. Catherine nodded approvingly. He thought you would. There's one more thing. My father also wanted you to know that he's recommending clemency for Mr. Henderson. Not because his crimes weren't serious, but because mercy is sometimes more powerful than punishment. Elena considered this unexpected development. Part of her wanted Robert to face the full consequences of his actions, but another part recognized the wisdom in Judge Morrison's approach. Robert's punishment mattered less than the precedent his conviction had established. Thank you for telling me, Elena said. Please thank your father for his consideration. As Catherine Morrison departed, Elena rejoined Marcus and Judge Harrison outside the courthouse. The Phoenix evening was warm and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. How do you feel? Marcus asked, as they walked toward their hotel. Elena considered the question carefully. Different than I expected. I thought Robert's conviction would feel like victory, but mostly it just feels like closure. Justice isn't always satisfying, Judge Harrison observed. Sometimes it's just necessary. Back at the hotel, Elena found a stack of telegrams waiting for her. More job offers from law firms, interview requests from newspapers, and invitations to speak at women's rights meetings across the country. Her case had become a symbol of something larger than her personal struggle. One telegram stood out from the rest. It was from Dr. Murphy, who had returned to his medical practice but continued following her legal progress. His message was simple but meaningful. Proud of you. The desert didn't break you. Nothing ever will. Elena smiled as she read his words. Dr. Murphy was right. The desert hadn't broken her. It had transformed her from a woman who accepted her fate into one who fought to change it. That night, Elena dreamed about the future for the first time since her ordeal began. She saw herself in a courtroom, not as a victim giving testimony, but as a lawyer arguing for justice. She saw other women following the path she was blazing, becoming doctors and lawyers and politicians despite society's resistance. The dream felt real, achievable, in a way that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Elena Valdez had survived being silenced in the desert. Now she was ready to help other women find their voices. The next morning brought Judge Morrison's sentencing decision. Robert Henderson received 3 years in territorial prison, enough to acknowledge the seriousness of his crimes, but merciful enough to allow for redemption. Elena attended the sentencing, but felt no need to speak. Justice had been served according to law, which was more than many women in her situation could expect. After the sentencing, Elena met with Prosecutor Williams to discuss Sheriff Coleman's upcoming trial. The case against Coleman would be stronger and clearer. His crimes had been more obviously brutal, and he had fewer supporters willing to defend him. Coleman's lawyer will try the same tactics Stevens used, Williams warned. They'll attack your character and suggest you brought your troubles on yourself. Elena smiled with newfound confidence. Let them try. I know who I am now, and I'm not ashamed of it. As Elena prepared to leave Phoenix for more legal study before Coleman's trial, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning in the desert, when Marcus cut the stitches from her lips. She had begun this journey as a victim seeking survival. She was ending it as an advocate seeking justice for others. The woman who had been left to die in silence had found her voice. Now she was going to use it to change the law itself, ensuring that future generations of women would never face the choice between conformity and survival. Elena Valdez was no longer just a survivor. She was a force for change, and the Arizona Territory would never be the same. Elena's pen scratched across the examination paper as sweat dripped onto the wooden desk, each question a battle she had prepared for with months of sleepless study. The territorial bar examination room felt like a furnace in the August heat, but Elena barely noticed the temperature as she fought the most important intellectual challenge of her life. Around her, 12 male candidates scribbled their answers with the casual confidence of men who had never doubted their right to be there. Elena was the only woman in the room, a fact that drew constant stares and whispered comments from her fellow test-takers. Question 15. Elena read silently. Discuss the legal precedent for excluding testimony based on the witness's character and social standing. Elena smiled grimly as she began writing. If anyone understood how character assassination worked in legal proceedings, it was her. Stevens had tried the same tactics during Robert's trial, attempting to make her politics more important than the facts of her case. The examination proctor, a stern man named Professor Davies, walked between the rows of desks like a general inspecting troops. When he passed Elena's desk, he paused longer than necessary, reading over her shoulder with obvious skepticism. Time, Professor Davies announced after 4 grueling hours. Put down your pens and step away from your papers. Elena's hand cramped as she set down her pen, but her mind felt sharp and clear. She had answered every question thoroughly, drawing on months of intensive study and her hard-won understanding of how law worked in practice versus theory. Outside the examination building, Elena found Marcus waiting with a pitcher of cold water and a concerned expression. He had driven her to the examination that morning, offering moral support that she appreciated more than she could express. "How did it go?" Marcus asked, as Elena gratefully accepted a glass of water. "Better than I hoped," Elena replied honestly. "The questions were fair, and I knew the material. Now we wait for the results." Marcus studied her face carefully. "You look different. More settled." Elena considered his observation. "I think I finally know what I'm meant to do with my life. Whether I pass this examination or not, I'm going to spend my time fighting for justice. The only question is whether I'll do it as a lawyer or as something else." They were interrupted by Professor Davies, who approached them with a formal expression and an envelope in his hand. Elena's heart started racing. Results weren't supposed to be available for another week. "Miss Valdez," Professor Davies said, his voice carefully neutral, "the examination committee has asked me to speak with you privately." Elena exchanged glances with Marcus, who squeezed her hand encouragingly before stepping back to give them privacy. Elena followed Professor Davies to a quiet corner of the building's front porch. "Miss Valdez, your examination performance was exceptional," Professor Davies began, and Elena felt a surge of hope. "In fact, your score was the highest we've recorded in the past 5 years." Elena blinked in surprise. "Then why do you look like you're about to deliver bad news?" Professor Davies sighed heavily. "Because the Territorial Bar Association is meeting tomorrow to discuss your application. Several members have expressed concerns about admitting a woman to practice law." Elena felt her hope curdle into familiar anger. "Concerns about my qualifications or concerns about my gender?" "Your gender, primarily," Professor Davies admitted. "Some members feel that allowing women into the legal profession would undermine public confidence in the law itself." Elena laughed bitterly. "Public confidence? Sheriff Coleman sewing my mouth shut didn't undermine public confidence, but me becoming a lawyer would?" Professor Davies looked uncomfortable but continued. "Judge Morrison has indicated he will support your admission, but he may not have enough influence to overcome the opposition. You should prepare yourself for the possibility of rejection." Elena felt the familiar weight of fighting against an entire system designed to exclude her, but she also felt something new, a quiet confidence that came from knowing her own worth, regardless of what others decided. "Thank you for the warning, Professor Davies," Elena said formally. "When will I know the committee's decision?" "Tomorrow evening. The meeting is scheduled for 2 o'clock. As Professor Davies departed, Elena rejoined Marcus with a complicated mix of emotions swirling in her chest. Her highest examination score meant nothing if the Bar Association refused to recognize her achievement. "Bad news?" Marcus asked. reading her expression. Complicated news, Elena replied. I passed the examination with the highest score in 5 years, but the Bar Association may refuse to admit me anyway. Marcus's face darkened with anger. On what grounds? On the grounds that I'm a woman, Elena said simply. Apparently, my gender is more important than my qualifications. They walked back toward town in thoughtful silence, Elena's mind already working through her options. If the Bar Association rejected her application, she could appeal to the territorial legislature. If that failed, she could move to a more progressive territory or state. The fight would continue regardless of tomorrow's decision. That evening, Elena received an unexpected visitor at her hotel. Catherine Morrison knocked on her door with urgent news that changed everything Elena thought she knew about the Bar Association meeting. Miss Valdez, I have information you need to hear, Catherine said, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of excitement and concern. Elena invited her in, curious about what could bring Judge Morrison's daughter to her hotel room after dark. Catherine paced the small space like a caged animal before finally settling into a chair. My father isn't the only judge supporting your admission, Catherine began. 3 other territorial judges have written letters recommending you for the bar. But there's something else, something that might change everything. Elena leaned forward, sensing that Catherine's news was significant. What is it? Sheriff Coleman escaped from prison yesterday, Catherine said quietly. He killed 2 guards during his breakout and disappeared into the desert. Federal marshals are hunting him, but he knows that country better than anyone. Elena felt her blood turn to ice water. Why are you telling me this? Catherine met her eyes directly. Because Coleman swore before his escape that he would finish what he started with you. The marshals think he might try to reach Phoenix before the territory can be alerted. Elena stood up abruptly, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. Coleman was a desperate man with nothing left to lose, and he blamed her for destroying his life. If he reached Phoenix, he would certainly try to kill her. When did this escape happen? Elena asked. 2 days ago, Catherine replied. But the news was kept quiet to avoid panic. My father thought you deserved to know the truth. Elena walked to her window and looked out at the darkening street below. Somewhere in the vast Arizona territory, a man who had once ordered her mouth sewn shut was riding toward Phoenix with murder on his mind. What do the marshals recommend? Elena asked. They want to move you to a safe location until Coleman is captured, Catherine said. Probably the military post at Fort McDowell. Elena shook her head firmly. I won't hide from that man again. I have a Bar Association meeting tomorrow that could determine my entire future. I'm not running away. Catherine looked concerned. Miss Valdez, Coleman is extremely dangerous. He has nothing left to lose and every reason to want you dead. Elena turned back to face Catherine, her decision already made. Then I'll have to be ready for him. I survived 3 days in the desert with my mouth sewn shut. I can survive one more confrontation with the man who put me there. As Catherine prepared to leave, she paused at the door. There's one more thing. The Bar Association meeting has been moved to the courthouse for security reasons. Federal marshals will be present, but they can't guarantee your safety. Elena nodded, understanding. Thank you for the warning. Please tell your father I appreciate his support, regardless of what happens tomorrow. After Catherine left, Elena sat alone in her hotel room, contemplating the strange turn her life had taken. Tomorrow she would face 2 crucial challenges: winning admission to the territorial bar, and possibly confronting the man who had tried to kill her months ago in the desert. Marcus knocked on her door an hour later, having heard about Coleman's escape through his own network of contacts. His face showed the same protective concern Elena had seen before dangerous situations. We're leaving town tonight, Marcus said without preamble. I have horses ready and supplies packed. We can be in Tucson by morning. Elena shook her head. I'm not running away from Coleman or from the Bar Association. Both fights end tomorrow, one way or another. Marcus studied her face, recognizing the determination that had kept her alive in the desert. Then I'm staying with you. Coleman won't get close enough to hurt you again. Elena felt grateful for Marcus's loyalty, but also worried about putting him in danger. You don't have to do this. This is my fight. No, Marcus said firmly. It stopped being just your fight the day I cut those stitches from your lips. We're in this together now." As Elena prepared for what might be the most important and dangerous day of her life, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The terrified woman left to die in the desert was gone, replaced by someone who refused to back down from any challenge. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with both the system that had tried to silence her and the man who had physically enforced that silence. Elena Valdez was ready for both fights. She had found her voice in the desert. Now, she would defend her right to use it, no matter the cost. The Phoenix courthouse buzzed with nervous energy as Elena walked through its doors at noon, federal marshals flanking her like protective shadows. Word of Coleman's escape had spread despite official attempts at secrecy, and the building crawled with armed men scanning every face for signs of trouble. Elena wore her best dress, dark blue with simple lines that suggested both respectability and strength. She had learned that appearances mattered in legal proceedings, and today she needed every advantage she could manage. Judge Morrison presided over the Bar Association meeting with the same stern authority he had shown during Robert's trial. 12 men sat around a polished wooden table, their faces ranging from supportive to openly hostile as Elena took her seat at the far end. "Gentlemen," Judge Morrison began, "we are here to consider the application of Miss Elena Valdez for admission to the territorial bar. Miss Valdez has passed the examination with the highest score recorded in recent years." Mr. Bradley, the oldest member of the association, leaned forward with obvious disapproval. "Judge Morrison, Miss Valdez's test scores are irrelevant. The practice of law requires qualities that no woman possesses: physical courage, emotional detachment, and the respect of male clients and juries." Elena kept her expression neutral despite the insult. She had expected this argument and prepared her response carefully. "Mr. Bradley," Elena said when Judge Morrison nodded for her to speak, "I have demonstrated physical courage by surviving 3 days in the desert after being left to die. I have shown emotional detachment by testifying calmly against the men who tried to murder me. As for respect, I believe that comes from competence, not gender." Another member, Mr. Walsh, spoke up with barely concealed hostility. "Miss Valdez, your notoriety makes you unsuitable for legal practice. Clients need lawyers who blend into courtrooms, not women who attract newspaper attention and political controversy." Elena felt her temper flare but kept her voice level. "Mr. Walsh, the law should serve justice, not hide from public scrutiny. If my presence in a courtroom makes people think more carefully about how justice is administered, that seems like an improvement." The debate continued for over an hour, with Elena fielding hostile questions about her politics, her teaching methods, and her unwomanly ambitions. She answered each challenge with the patience of someone who had learned to fight prejudice with facts rather than emotion. During a brief recess, Marcus approached Elena in the courthouse hallway with disturbing news. "Coleman was spotted 20 miles south of here this morning," he said quietly. "The marshals think he's heading for Phoenix." Elena felt her stomach tighten, but she refused to let fear derail her focus. "How long before he could reach town?" "Few hours at most," Marcus replied. "The marshals want to evacuate you immediately." Elena shook her head firmly. "This meeting will be over in an hour. I'm not abandoning everything I've worked for because Coleman wants another chance to kill me." Marcus looked frustrated but unsurprised by her decision. "Then we stay alert and finish this properly." When the meeting resumed, Judge Morrison called for a preliminary vote on Elena's admission. The result was closer than Elena had expected. 6 members in favor, 6 opposed. Judge Morrison, as the presiding officer, would cast the deciding vote. "Before I vote," Judge Morrison said, "I want to address the concerns raised about Miss Valdez's character and qualifications." Elena held her breath, knowing that her entire future hung on this man's next words. Miss Valdez has demonstrated exceptional legal knowledge, personal courage under extreme circumstances, and a commitment to justice that this territory desperately needs. Judge Morrison continued, "The question isn't whether she deserves admission to our bar. The question is whether we deserve a lawyer of her caliber." Elena felt tears threaten but blinked them back. Judge Morrison's support meant more than she could express. I vote to admit Miss Elena Valdez to the territorial bar, Judge Morrison announced. Motion carries 7-6. Elena stood slowly, feeling the weight of history in the moment. She was now officially a lawyer, the first woman admitted to practice law in the Arizona territory. The magnitude of the achievement was almost overwhelming. Congratulations, Miss Valdez, Judge Morrison said formally. You are hereby authorized to practice law in all territorial courts. The celebration was interrupted by Marshal Thompson, who burst into the meeting room with urgent news. Coleman has been spotted entering town from the south. We need to evacuate Miss Valdez immediately. Elena felt the familiar knot of fear in her stomach, but also something new, a calm determination that came from knowing she had already won the most important battle. No evacuation, Elena said clearly. If Coleman wants to find me, he can find me here, in this courthouse where justice is supposed to live. Judge Morrison looked concerned. Miss Valdez, this building isn't designed for defense against armed men. Then we make it defensible, Elena replied. Coleman has already taken too much from me. I won't let him take away this moment, too. Marshal Thompson coordinated the courthouse's defense with military efficiency. Deputies took positions at windows and doorways, while Elena was moved to Judge Morrison's chambers for additional protection. Marcus insisted on staying with her, despite the marshal's objections. This is crazy, Marcus said, as they waited in the judge's office. You just became a lawyer. Why risk everything for a confrontation with Coleman? Elena considered his question seriously. Because running away now would mean Coleman wins even if he dies trying to kill me. I need to face him as who I am now, not who I was when he left me in the desert. They didn't have to wait long. Coleman's voice echoed through the courthouse corridors like thunder, shouting challenges and threats that made Elena's blood run cold. Elena Valdez, Coleman roared. You destroyed my life. Now I'm going to finish what I started in the desert. Elena stood up despite Marcus's protests. I'm going out there. Absolutely not, Marcus said firmly. Let the marshals handle him. Elena shook her head. This fight started between Coleman and me. It should end the same way. Before Marcus could stop her, Elena opened the office door and stepped into the hallway. Coleman stood at the far end, his clothes dirty from hard travel and his eyes wild with desperate rage. He held a pistol in each hand, and Elena could see that he was beyond reason. Hello, Sheriff, Elena said, her voice carrying clearly down the hallway. You look terrible. Coleman's face twisted with fury. You think you've won, don't you? Think you can destroy good men and get away with it? Elena walked slowly toward him, ignoring the guns pointed at her chest. I didn't destroy you, Coleman. You destroyed yourself the day you decided justice was whatever you said it was. I was keeping order, Coleman screamed. People like you threaten everything decent folk have built. Elena stopped 20 feet from Coleman, close enough to see the madness in his eyes, but far enough to possibly dodge if he shot. People like me? You mean people who think for themselves? People who ask questions? People who refuse to stay quiet when injustice happens? Coleman raised his guns, his hands shaking with rage and exhaustion. I should have killed you myself instead of leaving you for the desert. Elena felt a strange calm settle over her. You tried to kill me, Coleman. You failed. Now I'm a lawyer, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure men like you can never again silence women like me. Not if you're dead, Coleman snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Elena smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Even if you kill me, Coleman, you've already lost. The world is changing. Women are finding their voices. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. Coleman's shot went wide as federal marshals rushed him from behind. The second shot never came as multiple lawmen tackled him to the courthouse floor. Elena watched his capture with detached satisfaction, feeling no need to gloat or celebrate. As Coleman was dragged away in chains, Elena realized that her ordeal was finally, truly over. The man who had ordered her mouth sewn shut was defeated. Her legal career was beginning, and the future stretched ahead full of possibilities she had never imagined. Marcus appeared at her side, his face pale with concern and admiration. You're the bravest person I've ever known, he said quietly. Elena considered his words. Not brave, just tired of being afraid. Judge Morrison approached them with a slight smile. Miss Valdez, your first case as a lawyer begins tomorrow morning. A woman in Tucson needs representation against her husband's business partners. Are you interested? Elena felt her heart skip with excitement. Her first client, her first case, her first chance to use her new authority to help someone who couldn't help herself. I'm very interested, Elena said. What are the charges? Fraud and conspiracy, Judge Morrison replied. The woman claims her husband's partners cheated her out of her inheritance after his death. It's complicated, but I think you'll find it educational. Elena nodded, already thinking through the legal challenges ahead. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new opportunities to fight for justice. But tonight, she was content to savor the victory she had earned through months of struggle and sacrifice. Elena Valdez had entered the Arizona territory as a silenced victim left to die in the desert. She was leaving it as a lawyer ready to change the world, one case at a time. The desert had tried to kill her voice. Instead, it had only made her stronger.